On a frigid Christmas Eve, a destitute janitor named Ethan risked everything placing his calloused hands on the keys of a lavish grand piano, his only aim to soothe his daughter's pain. But as the melody began, CEO Victoria Sterling froze on the mezzanine above. It was the secret love song her long-lost lover had written exclusively for her 16 years ago. How could an anonymous man from the dregs of society play the most sacred relic of her life? The truth was not hidden in the spotlight, but in the quiet shadows of Sterling Tower, where the only sound that echoed now was not the piano, but the desperate rhythm of survival. The gurgle of dirty water splashing into a black plastic bucket broke the midnight silence of Sterling Tower. Ethan Caldwell wrung the floor mop one last time, his rough hands raw from the cold water and chemical cleaners. He straightened up, pressing a fist into his aching lower back after 8 hours of constant bending. The wall clock read 11:45 p.m. His shift had ended 15 minutes ago, but a stubborn dark red wine stain on the marble floor refused to disappear completely. Ethan exhaled his breath, forming a thin cloud in the frigid air of the grand lobby, the heating system turned down to its lowest setting to save energy. He glanced toward the dark corner behind the reception desk. There, on 2 velvet chairs pushed together, his daughter Lily lay curled up under his faded gray company jacket. She was 7, and this was the 3rd Christmas Eve she had spent sleeping in a corner of her father's workplace. A familiar weight settled in Ethan's chest as he looked at her. Since it had become just the 2 of them, the bills, the rent, and the night shifts had stolen any possibility of hiring a babysitter. He had no choice but to hide her in forgotten corners, praying the manager wouldn't see. Lily stirred. Her small face winced. She let out a soft whimper, her tiny hand pulling up her pant leg. The cheap bandage on her knee had peeled at the edges, revealing a swollen red gash from a fall earlier that evening. Lily's eyes fluttered open, her large brown eyes welling with tears as she looked at him. "Daddy, my leg hurts so bad. Can you do the magic to make it stop?" The magic. It was their secret code. Not painkillers, not a doctor, but music. Ethan's heart ached as he looked at her. His gaze drifted to the center of the grand lobby. Under the dim glow of the standby lights, a Steinway grand piano sat gleaming and solitary, a luxurious decoration that people like him were never allowed to touch. Ethan's hand, still gripping the mop handle, tightened until his knuckles turned white. He scanned the empty lobby. The security camera in the corner of the ceiling had been slightly nudged off kilter when he'd been dusting earlier. The security office door was closed. A fierce struggle played out on his haggard face. On one side was the building's strict policy, the risk of being fired on the spot, of being thrown out onto the street in the dead of winter. On the other was the whimpering of his pained daughter, a child who had no presence, no party on this night. A father's love conquered a worker's fear. Ethan let out a determined breath. He leaned the mop against the wall and wiped his calloused, grimy hands on his work pants. He walked over, scooped Lily into his arms, and tiptoed toward the piano like a trespasser in a holy sanctuary. He didn't dare sit fully on the velvet-cushioned bench. He perched on the very edge, his body tense, his feet planted firmly on the floor, ready to spring up and run at the slightest sound. He settled Lily beside him, her head resting against his arm. Ethan's hands hovered over the keys. An ugly long scar running down his right hand was a painful contrast to the pristine ivory. When the first note sounded, Ethan's shoulders relaxed just a fraction. The melody of Midnight Serenade began to flow. At first the notes were timid, soft, as if afraid to disturb the vast space. But then memories flooded back with the music. He forgot the stain on the floor, forgot his janitor's uniform. The music became poignant, heartbreaking, filling the grand lobby. He played as if it were the last time his hands would ever be allowed to create something beautiful. Lily closed her eyes, her breathing evening out, the pain seemingly melting away with the notes. Just then, the mezzanine elevator opened. Victoria Sterling stepped out a phone she'd forgotten in her hand. Her face was etched with fatigue from a long social event. But she stopped dead in her tracks. She stood frozen on the balcony. The phone slipped from her hand, landing silently on the carpet. She didn't notice. All she could hear was that melody, the unique phrasing, the intentionally offbeat accents she had so passionately loved in Julian's 16 years ago. She looked down at the lobby. It wasn't Julian. It was just the hunched back of a janitor in a gray uniform, a small child beside him. The absurdity of it all made her dizzy. Victoria couldn't stop herself. She rushed down the marble staircase, the sharp clicks of her heels echoing urgently. "Hey, stop!" The sound jolted Ethan as if he'd been electrocuted. The reflexes of the powerless took over instantly. He snatched his hands back. The music stopped with a brutal silence. His face was a mask of pure panic. He didn't dare look up at the powerful woman storming toward him. He quickly pulled Lily off the bench, muttering frantic apologies before Victoria even reached him. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm leaving. I didn't mean to." Without waiting for a response, Ethan swept his daughter into his arms, hiding her face in his shoulder, and turned to flee toward the kitchen service exit like a thief caught in the act. Victoria reached the bottom of the stairs just as their figures were about to disappear through the door. In a rush of emotion and confusion, she didn't ask, "Who are you?" Instead, she screamed the name that had haunted her for 16 years. "Julian, is that you?" Ethan froze for a single second at the threshold. The name was like a whip cracking against his back. His shoulders went rigid, but he didn't turn around. He shoved the heavy door open and plunged into the snowy night, running from the woman he had secretly loved and sacrificed his youth to protect. The fire escape door slammed shut, leaving Victoria standing alone in the empty lobby, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart feeling like it would burst from her chest. A poor janitor, a powerful CEO, and a name that had been dead for 16 years. Why did the man freeze as if he'd been exposed upon hearing her former lover's name? And what could make a father so terrified that he would snatch his child and run into a snowstorm? Some secrets cannot be buried by time, only waiting for the right moment to rise again. The heavy fire escape door slammed shut behind Ethan, cutting off Victoria's desperate call. The December sleet slapped against his face, stinging like 1,000 tiny needles. Ethan didn't dare stop. He clutched Lily tighter in his arms, running through the narrow alley behind the tower to the bus stop on the corner of 5th Avenue. Under the bus stop's glass shelter, cracked in one corner, Ethan set his daughter down on the cold wooden bench. His breath came in ragged white plumes against the night air. His hands trembled as he took off his own outer jacket to wrap around Lily. It wasn't just from the cold. The name Julian was still ringing in his ears like a freshly awakened curse. This fear hadn't started with the piano. It had started 2 hours earlier when his dignity had been crushed under the heels of the wealthy. The memory returned sharp and painful. At 9 o'clock, the Sterling ballroom was a glittering spectacle of light and clinking glasses. Ethan had tried to hide Lily in the cramped cleaning supply closet behind the staircase. "Sit here and draw, sweetie," he had told her. But the sparkling lights of the giant Christmas tree in the lobby had proven too tempting for a 7-year-old. Lily had snuck out while he was cleaning in the kitchen area. Lost in admiration of the glass ornaments, she bumped into Richard Montgomery. Victoria's fiancé was holding a glass of red wine, drunkenly boasting to a group of partners about an upcoming merger. The wine sloshed all over his expensive suit. The sound of shattering glass silenced the entire party. Richard yelled instinctively, shoving the small child away. Lily fell her knee, slamming hard against the marble floor. That was the cause of the swollen gash. Ethan shot out from the shadows like an arrow. He helped his daughter up, apologizing profusely. "I'm so sorry, sir. She's just a child. It's my fault I wasn't watching." Richard looked at his wine-stained suit, his face contorted in disgust. He pointed a finger at Ethan, his voice booming across the hall. "What the hell are you doing in here? This is a VIP party, not a charity daycare for the gutter trash. Security. Get him out of here now." Ethan bowed his head, biting his tongue. He knew that if he fought back, he would lose his job instantly. Rent, food, his daughter's school fees. Everything depended on this humiliation. He pulled a worn handkerchief from his pocket to try and dab the wine from Richard's suit, but the man slapped his hand away violently. "Don't you dare touch me with those filthy hands. Clean this floor, now, with your bare hands," Richard commanded, wanting to use the public shaming to assert his dominance. The crowd fell silent. A few people looked away uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. Ethan looked at Lily, who was trembling behind him. Slowly he knelt. His knees hit the cold marble. But before he bent down to the stain, he turned and gently covered Lily's ears, whispering, "Close your eyes, sweetie. Daddy's just playing a cleaning game. Don't open them until I tell you to." He began to wipe the floor under Richard's contemptuous gaze. From the mezzanine balcony, Victoria had seen it all. She saw her fiancé's cruelty and the janitor's stooped, submissive back. She started to intervene, but her cousin Marcus Sterling grabbed her arm. "Don't make a scene, Victoria. Richard's drunk. Let security handle it." By the time Victoria shook off Marcus's hand to go down, Ethan had finished cleaning. He had scooped Lily up and hurried toward the back exit, leaving behind an echoing, uncomfortable silence. That was the first time she had truly seen him, a lonely, resilient figure so different from the other invisible staff. Back in the present, the last night bus screeched to a halt. Ethan carried Lily on board, finding a seat in the very back. Inside Sterling Tower, Victoria stood alone in the empty lobby. She bent down to pick up her phone. The screen lit up, showing an old background photo she had taken with Julian 16 years ago at a summer camp. She dialed her assistant Elena, her voice trembling but firm. "Elena, I'm sorry to call so late, but I need you to find the personnel file for the janitor on the night shift tonight, immediately." Victoria stared at the photo on her phone. She wasn't looking at the brightly smiling Julian in the center, but at the blurry, distant corner of the picture. There, a skinny young man was hunched over tuning a piano, his face half obscured, but his eyes, those eyes were identical to the man who had just run away. Victoria began to doubt her own memories. Was the anonymous boy in the corner of that old photo Ethan? And if it was him, why was a man who once tuned pianos for a prodigy now a humiliated janitor? What would the personnel file reveal tomorrow about this invisible man? The gray light of Christmas morning filtered through the small basement window, illuminating Ethan's tired face. In the cramped apartment, the old space heater whirred with a strained effort. Ethan woke early, carefully tucking the frayed wool blanket around Lily. He checked the wound on her knee. The swelling had gone down, but a large dark bruise remained. Ethan squeezed the last few drops of ointment from the plastic tube, gently applying it to her skin. He walked into the tiny kitchenette. The refrigerator was nearly empty, holding only half a carton of milk and 2 eggs. He made a simple breakfast of scrambled eggs and 2 slices of toast burnt at the edges, because the toaster's temperature knob had been broken for months. While waiting for the toast, Ethan bent down and pulled out a battered notebook hidden under a placemat. Inside weren't bills or budgets. It was filled with pages of musical notations hastily scribbled in dull pencil. He looked at an unfinished staff, then down at his scarred right hand. His fingers twitched, but they were stiff and trembled. With a sigh, Ethan snapped the notebook shut and shoved it deep into the back of a drawer. He told himself that last night was the last mistake he would ever allow himself to make. At the same time, in the CEO's office of the Sterling Corporation, Victoria hadn't gone home. She sat silently amidst a pile of old personnel files, the light from her computer screen reflecting on her pale face. Elena entered, placing a thin folder on the desk. "This is everything we have on him. Ethan Caldwell." Victoria opened the file. The ID photo showed a gaunt face, the eyes avoiding the camera. Education high school diploma. His work history for the past 15 years was a list of manual labor jobs, loading docks, dishwashing, warehouse work. There was not a single mention of music, not a word about piano or the prestigious arts camp from 16 years ago. Victoria was about to close the folder when a small clipped paper fell out from the back. It was a copy of his pre-employment physical from 3 years ago. Under the section for pre-existing conditions, the doctor had noted impairment of the right hand due to a past industrial accident, 40% loss of fine motor skills. The small text below made Victoria's heart clench. Hydraulic press accident 2008, Sterling Manufacturing, Ohio branch. 2008 was when she had just started taking over the business. That factory had been under the direct management of her father, Arthur Sterling. Victoria immediately picked up her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart, but had never dared to call. The line picked up after several rings. The old weary voice of Professor Silas Thorne came through. "I've been waiting for this call for 16 years, Victoria." "Professor Thorne, do you remember a student named Ethan Caldwell?" Victoria asked her, breathing quickening. Silas was silent for a long moment before answering. "Don't believe what you see, Victoria. Some talents hide in the shadows, and we mistook the shadow for the sun. The office door suddenly burst open. Arthur Sterling entered with Richard, their presence filling the room with an oppressive weight. Arthur saw the file on her desk, his eyebrow raising in annoyance. "Why are you wasting Christmas morning concerned with a low-level janitor?" Arthur asked, his voice as sharp as a blade. Victoria quickly flipped the file shut, trying to keep her voice calm. "I was just reviewing some old personnel errors. Dad, the accident at the Ohio factory in 2008. Do you remember it?" Arthur's expression didn't change, but his hand tightened on his cane. "Accidents happen every day, Victoria. It's the cost of doing business. Don't let sentimentality get in the way of progress." Arthur and Richard left after reminding her of the evening's party with the shareholders. Victoria reopened her phone. The call with Silas was still connected. Professor Thorne's voice came through the speakerphone, clear and devastating. "Don't trust your father. He knew who Ethan was. He was the one who signed the termination papers right after that hand was crushed to cover his tracks. And Victoria, Julian never wrote that song." Victoria dropped the phone on the desk. Her perfect world, built upon a revered father and a sacred first love, began to shatter. The following afternoon, Victoria entered a high-end nursing home on the outskirts of the city. Professor Silas Thorne's room was filled with the smell of antiseptic and the mustiness of old sheet music. Silas sat in a wheelchair, staring out the window with clouded eyes. He offered no pleasantries, simply gesturing for her to open the worn, leather-bound journal, already placed on the tea table. Victoria turned the pages. It was the original manuscript of Midnight Serenade. The notes were written in purple ink, the handwriting strong, but filled with crossed-out sections and emotional notes in the margins. It was completely different from the clean, soulless copy Julian had once shown her. On the final page, a small inscription made her breath catch in her throat. "For V.S., the girl with stars in her eyes." Silas began to speak, his voice as raspy as sandpaper on wood. He confessed that Julian was merely a performer with a flashy exterior, but was hollow inside. Ethan was the one who wrote the soul of that music. The poor young man had agreed to stay in the shadows in exchange for money to treat his sick mother, and most importantly, because Ethan believed that only someone like Julian was worthy of standing next to Victoria. "I was a coward, Victoria." Silas bowed his head, his voice trembling. 16 years ago, I was afraid of your father, afraid of losing my position as dean. I lied to myself that staying silent was respecting Ethan's wishes. But when you called me this morning, I knew God had given me one last chance not to die a hypocrite." Silas revealed an even crueler truth about the accident. After Julian died, Ethan had no intention of claiming his work. He only wanted to comfort her. But Arthur Sterling had intercepted him. Her father had forced Ethan into the Sterling factory to do heavy manual labor. The press accident that year was the result of ruthlessly cutting costs on safety maintenance. When Ethan's hands were crushed, Arthur had come to his hospital bed, not to apologize, but to offer a check in exchange for his permanent silence. Ethan had signed because at that moment he needed the money to save what little function he had left in his hand to care for his ailing mother. At the same time, at a dusty construction material depot, Ethan was hauling heavy bags of cement from a truck to the warehouse. Each step was laborious, his old boots sinking into the mud. His right hand, covered by a thick work glove, still trembled violently with every exertion. A sharp pain shot from the old scar radiating from his wrist, all the way up to his shoulder. During a break, Ethan sat down on a pile of broken bricks, taking a sip of water from a crushed plastic bottle. He pulled a piece of old newspaper from his breast pockets. It had been wrapped around his sandwich and smoothed out a small corner that had a picture of Victoria at a project inauguration. He looked at the photo, smiled faintly, then carefully folded the clipping and placed it back over his heart before getting up to continue his work. Victoria left the nursing home with a heart heavy with regret. She realized that her luxury, her celebrated Sterling name, were all built on the silent sacrifice and immense pain of an anonymous man. She immediately told her driver to cancel all her appointments and drive to the address of the construction site where Ethan was working. The luxury Bentley pulled up in front of the noisy material yard. Victoria stepped out her expensive heels, sinking into the mud, but she didn't care. From a distance, she saw Ethan hauling a bag of cement, the back of his shirt soaked with sweat, his steps faltering from exhaustion. Ethan sensed the strange presence and looked up. The moment their eyes met through the thick dust, the cement bag on his shoulder fell to the ground, bursting open. Panicked and ashamed of his grimy appearance, Ethan started to turn and run. "Ethan, don't run anymore. Please." Victoria called out, her voice cracking over the roar of machinery. Ethan stood frozen beside the burst cement bag, dust coating him like a statue in the middle of the roaring construction site. Victoria stood a few feet away, her designer shoes buried in mud and sludge. The site foreman began yelling at Ethan for the ruined bag of cement. Startled, Ethan reacted like a long-time laborer, bending down to try and clean up the mess with his trembling hands. But Victoria rushed forward. She grabbed his left arm, his only uninjured one. "Stop! Come with me." Ethan pulled his arm back, his eyes filled with defensiveness and shame. He didn't want her to see him in this pathetic state. "Ms. Sterling, I'm working. I can't leave. I need today's wages." His stark statement about survival was like a bucket of cold water on Victoria's emotional turmoil. She turned to the foreman, pulled a thick wad of cash from her purse, and threw it on his wooden desk, enough to hire Ethan for the next 10 days, then gestured for Ethan to leave. Ethan looked at the money, then at her. He said nothing, silently walking into the makeshift shed to change out of his dusty work clothes and into his own worn but clean set. When he came out, he spoke softly, his voice hoarse. "You didn't have to do that. I don't take charity." "This isn't charity," Victoria replied, her voice softening, but remaining firm. "I need to talk to you about the music, about Julian, and about you." Ethan reluctantly got into Victoria's car. He sat huddled against the window, trying to keep his clothes from touching the fragrant new leather seats. He asked her to stop in front of an old public elementary school to pick up Lily. Seeing his daughter's excitement at the beautiful car, Ethan gently shushed her. His tenderness toward the child made Victoria's heart ache. She realized that over the past 16 years, his music hadn't vanished. It had simply transformed into love for his child. They descended the narrow steps into Ethan's basement apartment. The tiny room, though tidy, smelled of dampness and old cooking. Ethan made tea in a chipped pot, placing a hot mug in front of Victoria before sitting on the edge of the bed, as there were no other chairs. Victoria asked directly, her voice catching, "Why didn't you ever tell me the truth? Why did you let Julian take all the credit?" Ethan stared into the steam rising from his mug, his voice low and sorrowful. "Because back then, you looked at him like he was your whole world. Julian was the sun, and I was just the shadow. I wrote that music for you, but I knew you would only be truly happy if he was the one playing it. After he passed, I was going to tell you, but then I saw you crying, clutching that sheet music like it was your only lifeline. I chose silence to protect what little peace you had left." Ethan held up his scarred right hand. "See, I was right. You became a queen, and I'm just a father trying to keep his daughter from going hungry." Victoria was about to reach out and touch his scar to apologize on behalf of her family when a loud, frantic banging echoed from the top of the stairs. The landlady, Mrs. Higgins, called down, her voice panicked. "Ethan, there are some men in black suits looking for you. They look dangerous." Ethan shot up his face, pale. He pushed Victoria into the corner behind a canvas wardrobe. "Hide in here. Don't let them see you. Please." The flimsy wooden door was shoved open. Richard Montgomery walked in, flanked by 2 large bodyguards. He looked around the squalid room with a contemptuous smirk, a thick legal folder in his hand. He had come to finish what Victoria's father had started. Victoria held her breath behind the old canvas curtain, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles were white. Through a small gap, she saw Richard stride into the basement apartment, his polished leather shoes, stepping on Lily's faded teddy bear doormat. He surveyed the room with disgust, then tossed a stack of documents onto the rickety wooden table. A voluntary resignation and a non-disclosure agreement. Richard said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Sign it, and you'll get $5,000. Enough for you to move out of this slum to somewhere no one knows who you are." Ethan stood protectively in front of Lily, his back slightly stooped, but his gaze was unwavering. "I did nothing wrong. I'm not taking your money." Richard sneered. He stepped closer. His voice a whisper, but loud enough for Victoria to hear every word. "You think Victoria actually cares about you. She just pities you like a stray dog with a broken leg. Sign it, or I'll make a call to Child Protective Services. With your current income and this living situation, they'll have your daughter in a foster home before you know it for parental negligence." Ethan's fists clenched his entire body, shaking with rage, but he didn't dare fight back. The threat against Lily was the cruelest possible blow, leaving him completely paralyzed. Just as Richard signaled for his bodyguards to step forward menacingly, Victoria could take no more. She ripped the curtain aside and stepped out, her eyes blazing with fury. Victoria's sudden appearance stunned Richard. He stammered, "Victoria, what are you doing in this filthy place?" Victoria didn't answer him. She walked straight to the table, picked up the legal folder, and ripped it in half right in front of his face. She looked her arranged fiancé dead in the eye. "Get out of here, now, before I call the police and report you for blackmail and trespassing." Richard's face turned purple with shame and anger. He left in a huff, after leaving a final warning that her position as CEO wouldn't be secure by morning. The room fell silent again. Lily burst into tears, terrified, and Ethan quickly scooped her up to comfort her. Victoria watched them, her heart aching. She knew she had just declared war on an empire. The next morning, Victoria walked into her father's private office. Arthur Sterling was calmly sipping tea with a smug-looking Richard standing beside him. Victoria entered without fear. She placed a single sheet of paper on her father's mahogany desk, her own letter of resignation as CEO. "I won't let you and Richard drag Ethan through court," Victoria said, her voice resolute. "If you do, I will leave this corporation immediately and take my entire executive team with me. You can replace me, but are you so sure Richard can keep the secret of the 2008 accident quiet when the stock price plummets?" Arthur let out a cold laugh, a cruel glint in his eyes. He didn't answer her, but stood up, grabbing his cane. Through the massive glass wall of his office, Victoria looked down at the lobby on the ground floor. Her heart tightened when she saw Ethan standing there. He was wearing his old work uniform, holding Lily's hand, placing his employee ID card on the reception desk to return it. "Look, he's come to surrender," Arthur said coldly before heading for the door. "Let's go, Richard. Let's see how long his tattered pride lasts in front of me." Victoria ran after them in a panic. She knew her father was preparing to crush Ethan one last time, right in the grand lobby of the building. The ground floor lobby of the Sterling Corporation was vast and silent, the chill from the white marble floor seeping into Ethan's tired legs. He stood before the reception desk, where the employees on a normal day would look right through him, as if he were part of the wall. Ethan placed his employee ID and his janitor's uniform on the marble countertop. He had washed them clean, folding every crease neatly as if to pack away 3 years of his life. The receptionist looked at him with pity, her lips moving, but no words coming out. Ethan just offered a faint smile, a nod of his head, serving as a final farewell. Lily stood beside him, her small hand clutching his rough finger tightly. She looked around in wonder at the men in expensive suits gliding past. Ethan bent down, carefully adjusting her frayed scarf. He wanted to lead her out of this place quickly before the ghosts of the past could catch up. But the sharp, authoritative click of a cane on marble echoed through the lobby. The VIP elevator doors had opened. Arthur Sterling emerged every step, carrying the immense pressure of a man who held the fates of thousands in his hands. Richard followed closely behind while Victoria raced to get ahead of them. Arthur blocked Ethan's path just before the revolving doors. He didn't shout. He simply looked down at Lily with cold condescension. "Running away? After turning this entire corporation upside down with your fairy tales?" Ethan stopped. He didn't bow his head, nor did he step back. "I'm not running, Mr. Sterling. I'm just returning what doesn't belong to me." Richard interjected, his tone threatening. "You think returning a plastic card solves everything? I could sue you for harassment and blackmailing the CEO right now." Arthur waved a hand for Richard to be quiet. He took another step closer to Ethan, his voice low but razor sharp. "Look at your daughter. Do you plan to drag her onto the streets to beg with you? If you're smart, you'll sign that agreement to disappear from this city, and I'll give you enough money for her to have a different future. Don't let your pathetic pride ruin her life." Ethan looked down at Lily. Then he raised his hands and gently covered his daughter's ears. He didn't want a single one of these cynical words to enter her innocent soul. He looked up directly into the eyes of the most powerful man in the city. "Mr. Sterling, you use money to buy your daughter's future. I use truth to nurture my daughter's soul. Your money can buy silence, but it can never buy respect. That's what your daughter craves, but it's something you've never been able to give her. Victoria stood frozen behind them. Ethan's words were like a knife slicing through the gilded facade of her family. She stepped forward, placing herself between Ethan and her father. "Dad, let them go," Victoria said, her voice trembling, but clear. "I'm not begging you to spare him. I'm begging you to save the last shred of humanity for the Sterling name. If you try to stop them, I will publicly resign right here in this lobby in front of all your employees." She looked around. The receptionists, security guards, and cleaning staff had all stopped working. They were watching. The crowd's gaze no longer held fear of Arthur, but a silent judgment. Arthur Sterling realized he had lost. He hadn't lost a legal battle. He had lost all control over his daughter. He let out a cold snort, turned, and walked straight to his waiting car, leaving Richard standing alone and exposed in the middle of the grand lobby. Silence returned. Victoria turned to Ethan, her eyes welling with tears. Are you okay?" Ethan looked at her. He saw her sacrifice, but that very act raised the wall between them even higher. She had just been willing to give up an empire for him. He had nothing to offer in return but the burden of a broken man. "Thank you, Victoria," Ethan said softly. "But you belong here, and I was just a wrong note in your symphony." He took Lily's hand, turned, and walked through the revolving doors, disappearing into the bustling crowd on the street as snow began to fall. Victoria stood rooted to the spot in the warm lobby, watching their small figures fade into the distance. She whispered to herself, her voice lost in the silence. "You weren't the wrong note, Ethan. You were the entire melody." She turned to Elena, who had just rushed to her side. "Find me the address of Mr. Kowalski's old instrument shop, immediately." The Bentley stopped at the entrance of a small alley in the old quarter where rows of red brick buildings were stained by time. Victoria stepped out, motioning for her driver and Elena to wait. She didn't want to bring anything from the Sterling Corporation into this space. She pushed open the heavy wooden door of Kowalski's Music. A brass bell jingled, carrying with it the scent of pine varnish and dusty old paper. Behind the repair counter, old Mr. Kowalski was meticulously restringing a cello. He merely glanced up at Victoria over his half-moon glasses, nodded slightly, and gestured for her to listen to the sound coming from the back room. It was a piano. The melody was simple, without any technical flourish, but it was warm and patient. Victoria tiptoed closer to a faded red velvet curtain. Through a gap, she saw Ethan sitting at an old upright piano, its black paint chipped in many places. Lily was nestled in her father's lap. Ethan's uninjured left hand played steady low chords, providing a foundation for his scarred right hand, which gently guided his daughter's tiny one. He patiently showed Lily how to press each key. "Gently, sweetie," Ethan whispered, his voice surprisingly clear. "Let the note tell its story, just like you're telling me about your day." Lily nodded, her tiny finger pressing down on a G. "Does this story have a happy ending, Daddy?" Ethan smiled softly, leaning down to kiss her hair. "The ending is in how you play it, Lily." Victoria stood watching, transfixed. She saw a completely different Ethan. Here among broken old instruments, he wasn't a timid janitor or a self-conscious cripple. He was a teacher, a complete father. When a key got stuck, Lily grimaced and said, "The piano is hurt again," and Ethan sighed, muttering that it was getting old and weak, just like his back. Victoria stepped into the room. The soft click of her heels on the wooden floor startled Ethan. He instinctively pulled down his sleeve to cover the scar on his right hand, but then he paused when he saw the calm in her eyes. "I went to the old conservatory," Victoria said, leaning against the side of the piano instead of sitting. "I saw your file. You were never expelled, Ethan. You withdrew your name yourself." Ethan looked down at the discolored keys. "The tuition was too high back then, and after the accident, I didn't see the point in continuing." Victoria took a pale blue envelope from her handbag. It wasn't cash, but a professional contract. "The Sterling Foundation is establishing a community music center for underprivileged children. I need a director who knows how to teach kids to love music before they learn to read notes. I'm not hiring you out of pity, Ethan. I'm hiring you because I just saw something that renowned professors don't have the patience of a father." Ethan looked at the envelope, then at his stiff right hand. He didn't take it immediately. Instead, he placed his hands on the keys. "Before we talk about the job, I want you to hear the real ending of Midnight Serenade, the part Julian never heard. Ethan began to play. The melody no longer carried the tragic, hopeless tone Victoria had always known. It shifted to a brighter, more intense key, yet one that was forgiving. It was the sound of a man who had learned to accept the broken pieces of his life and reassemble them into something new. As the final note faded into silence, Ethan turned to Victoria. His eyes no longer held the look of a man on the run. "This piece was never about loss," Ethan said softly. "It was about moving on. If you can accept a director with one offbeat hand, then I'll take the job." Victoria smiled a smile no longer burdened by the past. She held out her hand, waiting for a handshake to confirm their new partnership. 1 month later, the last of January's rain poured down on the city, turning the asphalt roads into small rivers that reflected the blurry neon lights. But inside the old port warehouse, now renovated into the Sterling Community Music Center, the atmosphere was warm and vibrant. Ethan was perched precariously on a tall A-frame ladder in the middle of the main hall. He wore a pair of faded jeans and a red and black flannel shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal his strong forearms. Though his business card read, Artistic Director, Ethan still had the habits of a manual laborer. He did everything himself. "Director Caldwell, are you trying to put the maintenance crew out of a job?" A clear voice called from the main entrance. Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow and looked down. Victoria was standing there, shaking out a dripping umbrella. She was in a business suit, but had removed her formal scarf, looking much more approachable than she did at the corporation. "This light bulb keeps flickering and distracting the kids," Ethan said with a laugh, climbing down the ladder expertly. He took the bottle of water Victoria offered and took a long drink. "Here for a surprise inspection. I'm the chair of the foundation. I have every right to check on my investment," Victoria joked, her eyes glancing toward the glass-walled classroom behind him. Inside, Lily and about 20 other children, their clothes a bit grimy and worn, sat in a circle clapping along to the rhythm of a folk song. The sound of their laughter echoed, chasing away the gloom of the rainy day. Victoria watched Ethan as he turned to look at the kids. His eyes shone with a simple pride and happiness, a light she had never seen in Julian or any of the successful men who surrounded her. Here, among the rough brick walls and old instruments, Ethan was a king in his own kingdom. About next month's curriculum, Ethan turned back, his tone more serious. "I think we should postpone teaching music theory." Victoria raised an eyebrow, taking out her notebook. "Why the board wants to see measurable results?" "Music isn't on paper, Victoria. It's in the air." Ethan led her to the window, pointing out at the rain. "What do you hear?" "The sound of rain," Victoria answered. "No, listen closer. The raindrops hitting the tin roof are a snare drum. The sound of tires on the wet road is a sustained violin note. The rumble of thunder is a bass drum. I want to teach these kids to hear the rhythm of life first. Once they fall in love with sound, they'll want to learn the notes to capture it." Victoria looked at him stunned for a moment, then smiled, nodding as she wrote in her notebook. "All right, approved. The budget for percussion and field trips will be increased." There was no condescension of a superior to a subordinate, only the easy rapport of two partners building a dream together. Late that afternoon, the rain intensified, accompanied by strong gusts of wind. The streets flooded, paralyzing traffic. "Ethan, you can't take Lily back to the basement apartment in this weather. The water must have flooded the entryway by now," Victoria said with concern, watching Ethan bundle his daughter into a raincoat. "But," Ethan hesitated, "come to my place. My penthouse is in the Millennium Tower nearby, just a 5-minute walk across the covered skywalk." Not giving him a chance to refuse, Victoria took Lily's hand. On the way, Lily chattered excitedly, showing off a math test with a perfect score. Ethan ruffled her hair, praising her, but his eyes held a flicker of sadness as he glanced down at her sneakers. They were worn out. The glue on the toes had come undone, and her socks were soaked through. Victoria noticed his glance. She didn't say anything right away. Only after the three of them were settled in her warm, luxurious penthouse did she broach the subject tactfully. "Oh, Lily," Victoria said, rummaging through her purse and pulling out a gift card which she had in fact just grabbed from a stack of company bonus vouchers. "The center has a new policy. The children of employees who get a perfect score on a test get a gift card to the sports store. This is for you." Ethan looked up sharply at Victoria. He knew there was no such policy. The pride of a poor man rose within him, but then he looked at his daughter's cold, wet feet and at Victoria's sincere, non-patronizing gaze. She was protecting his dignity in front of his child. Ethan nodded slightly, a smile serving as his deepest thank you. Dinner that evening was a strange affair. Victoria's state-of-the-art six-figure kitchen was rarely used. She fumbled, unable to figure out how to turn on the induction stove. "Let me," Ethan said, rolling up his sleeves and stepping into the kitchen as if it were his own. "You just point me to the salt and the pasta." A family scene that Victoria had long forgotten materialized before her. A man cooking at the stove, the fragrant smell of tomato sauce filling the air, a child drawing at the kitchen island, and her standing beside them, washing vegetables. The coldness of the marble and glass seemed to melt away in the warmth of human presence. After dinner, an exhausted Lily fell asleep on the plush sofa. Ethan and Victoria took their drinks. His was hot tea out onto the glass-enclosed balcony, looking down at the city blurry in the rain. "My father, he left the city yesterday," Victoria said suddenly, breaking the silence. "He went back to the farm down south. He wanted me to tell you he's sorry, though I know an apology doesn't change anything." Ethan swirled the hot tea in his cup, the steam rising to his resolute face. "Victoria, I used to hate him. I hated the whole world. But hate is like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. The only one who withers away is you." He turned to look at her, his gaze deep. "I forgave him a long time ago, not because he deserved it, but because I deserved to be at peace. I didn't want to carry that boulder in my heart anymore." Victoria looked at the man beside her. He wasn't the brilliant boy from her youth, nor the broken man she had rediscovered. He was like an old gnarled tree that had weathered many storms, but stood strong and forgiving. "You're much stronger than I ever imagined, Ethan," she whispered. "No," Ethan shook his head, his voice softening. "It's because someone pulled me out of the mud. Thank you for finding me." The shift in their address was as natural as breathing. Victoria felt her heart skip a beat. The rain stopped. Ethan woke Lily to go home. Victoria walked them to the elevator. There was no cinematic romantic kiss. But when Ethan held out his hand, Victoria took it, his scarred, rough, but incredibly warm hand. She gave it a gentle squeeze, conveying all her trust. "See you at the center tomorrow, boss." Ethan winked a radiant smile on his face. "See you, director." Victoria smiled back. The elevator doors closed, but Victoria's heart felt wide open. She went back inside, and the penthouse no longer felt empty. However, life always has its unexpected turns. The next morning, as Ethan arrived at the center, the mailman handed him an envelope with a striking red seal. It was from the National Conservatory of Music. They weren't sending a bill, they were sending an invitation. A benefit concert titled Hidden Stars. And they wanted Ethan Caldwell, a legendary former student, to perform as a special guest. The paper trembled in Ethan's hand, his lifelong dream, the stage he had craved. But now, with his damaged hands, would it be a moment of glory or the ultimate humiliation? 3 months later, the winter chill had given way to warm spring breezes. Ethan stood in the wings of the National Conservatory's grand concert hall, his hands clasped tightly together. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit that Victoria had personally picked out for him. On the other side of the velvet curtain, the murmur of 1,000 audience members and the brilliant glare of the stage lights made his throat go dry. This was his greatest fear and his final dream. Victoria came closer. She didn't take his hand, not wanting to add to his pressure. She just stood there close enough for him to feel her presence. "You don't have to prove anything to them," she said softly. "Just play for yourself." Ethan looked out toward the stage, then down at his scarred right hand. He nodded, took a deep breath, and walked out. When he sat down at the 9-foot concert grand, the entire hall fell silent. The notes of Midnight Serenade filled the air. This time, it was complete whole and free from the shadows of the past. However, when he reached the soaring climatic chorus, the fingers on his right hand suddenly stiffened. A note slipped, creating a discordant sound in the vast space. A flicker of panic crossed Ethan's face. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Whispers began to ripple through the audience. But then, Ethan saw Lily standing in the wings, smiling and giving him a thumbs up. He closed his eyes. Instead of trying to hide his imperfection, he leaned into it. He turned the flawed notes into soulful pauses, transformed the trembling of his hands into the very spirit of the melody. He wasn't playing with the technique of a prodigy. He was playing with all the reassembled broken pieces of his life. For the finale, Lily tiptoed onto the stage. She sat down next to her father, using her own small hands to play the supporting bass notes for him. The purity of the child blended with the resilience of the father, creating an ending as radiant as the dawn. The hall was silent for 3 seconds, after the last note faded, and then a storm of applause erupted. Professor Silas Thorne was the first to rise from his wheelchair, tears streaming down his face. Victoria stood in the front row. She didn't clap. She simply placed a hand over her heart, looking at him with absolute reverence. Ethan knew that tonight he had truly come home. A few weeks after the concert, spring sunshine flooded the Central Park. Ethan and Victoria sat together on a wooden bench, watching Lily fly a kite with a group of other children. Ethan took a sip of coffee from a paper cup, feeling the warmth spread through him. The center just enrolled 10 new students, he said, his eyes never leaving his daughter. We might need to find another classroom. Victoria leaned back on the bench, smiling at the soaring kites. I've already approved the budget, but on one condition. You have to teach me the end of that piece, the part Lily played. Ethan turned to look at her. The afternoon sun reflected in his eyes, peaceful and bright. The tuition will be very expensive, he teased gently. I have a lifetime to pay for it. Victoria replied, her voice as light as the breeze but certain. They didn't hold hands. There were no romantic vows. They just sat there shoulder to shoulder, enjoying each other's presence on an ordinary afternoon. There would still be bills to pay and old scars would still ache on rainy days, but their melody had begun a new chapter, gentle and enduring. Sometimes the most beautiful melodies come not from perfect keys, but from souls that were once broken, yet still find the courage to sing. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone you cherish. And don't forget to listen for the quiet melodies all around you. Farewell, and until we meet again.